joining us today, John. We've got Jon K Uhler on We Are Change today. I met John via Twitter through about three years ago. We were fighting the good fight against good and evil, speaking out on the impact of pornography on society and also the sexualization of children via programs including Safe Schools. I've only recently got back in touch with John on Facebook because I was banned on Twitter. He gets banned on Facebook and Twitter just as much as I do for speaking the truth. John worked for the Pennsylvania State Department of Corrections for 11 years with psychopaths, serial killers, sex offenders and pedophiles as a counsellor. So, John, do you want to talk about your work as a prison counsellor?
To transition to heading up one of the state's high-intensity sex offender units. That's a 65-bed residential unit. That's where all the high-intensity, those that are assessed to be high-intensity or sexually violent predators. And from there, I was trained in the Hare psychopathy checklist. Robert Hare out of British Columbia was flown in by the State Department of Corrections, and a few of us were selected to be trained by him. So I'm certified in the PCLR. At that time, the Department of Corrections was considering doing forensic assessments for what's called civil commitments, keeping guys in prison that were deemed to be at risk. They're probably doing that, but they didn't go as much as they should have. And from there, did a lot of parole assessments for not just general population inmates, but also the sex offender inmates. And after 11 years, I decided it was probably time to retire. So that was my step. But what I found was some very unique things because I was very intense and purposeful as I was starting my career working in the prison system. Because coming as a therapist, I wanted to know what caused men to harm people. Not only as a therapist am I most effective when I can kind of get behind the eyes of a client and see what's going on and seeing what motivates them, but especially with respect to the sex offenders, having worked with survivors, I was very interested. Plus, I was very intense. I mean, if you work with survivors, if you're halfway normal, you're going to have a lot of anger. You're going to have a lot of rage. It's called vicarious trauma. You can't hear stories of someone that's gone through a lot and it not affect you. And so, quite frankly, it generates rage on the inside of you. Now, does that mean you're a frothing, raving maniac? No, it just means you will have to do something with that. For me, not only personally exercising those kind of things, but it just in terms of my overall approach then, especially once I started working in the prison system, I was very intense and very purposeful in trying to figure out why did offenders do what they did? Because they hurt my former clients in general. These are the men that were everybody's worst nightmare. I think what made me different a little bit was because I had that experience, unlike the majority of my coworkers or counterparts in the psychology department, I became known as sort of like the crazy professor off the movie Back to the Future. I had a whiteboard put in my office, and I was generating charts, and I just was always digging. You don't have to working in a prison. It's a big bureaucracy. I don't really fault my coworkers, but on the other hand, I just was driven. I also knew that most of the research, if not virtually all of it, is done by, as far as sex offenders, is done by people in academia or outside the prison system. So if they want to do in-depth research, what do? They have to go through the process. It's a very lengthy process. They get a few hours, if not maximum a few days, to sit down with some guys who have volunteered or agreed, and they're going to interview them. And that's what makes for intensive research. Well, here I was, not just days, not just weeks, not just months, but years. And I have a set of keys. I have access to these guys 24/7 in a way, I mean, during my shift. I can interview them as much as I want to. I can go into solitary where the average researcher can't. The average researcher, when they're going to interview someone, as long as the guy is good, he can be brought out for an interview. But if he's acting out, that interviewer will never, the interview's canceled. They'll never be able to interview them. Well, my role, especially doing what was called the Secure Special Needs Unit, I was in solitary, and they were in solitary. And so I knew I was being given a very unique opportunity. I had access to all files. I had access to all criminal history, juvenile histories. Most of us think that juvenile histories are sealed. They're not. I had access to all psychosocials, medical files, psychiatric files, corroborating information. Phone calls in prisons are taped. The security office are the ones to do that. Somebody on Twitter started saying, "Uhler listened to phone calls." It's like, really? No, psychology staff doesn't even have, even if we could, I'll tell you what, I have no interest in listening to a phone call. Why? I just don't have interest. I don't need to. In one's role as a psychology staff, it just doesn't make a difference to me. Now, could I use some of that material? In a way, but it's different when you're in prison. So, but the reality is the security, at least in the U.S. Or the U.S. prisons, the security office is the one that listens in on phone calls. The mail room is the one that'll assess and open up mail. Psychology actually has to kind of inquire for that information, but they'll give it to us. We then also have the opportunity in prison, unlike an outside therapist, we have the opportunity to ask guards or officers how the inmate is doing, and everything's on film. We know what they're watching. And here's the best thing. There are cell searches all the time. So we can find out if somebody's hiding something. In the case of sex offenders, we can find out if a pedophile is hiding pictures. Is any therapist on the outside seriously going to be able to find that? Absolutely not. So when anybody, including some of these predator apologists, I call them, there's a couple out of Canada, they're claiming to be experts. It's a joke. Now, I would not have known any of this had I not worked in prison. We can also talk to family members if they're willing to talk to us, or we get a release. We have the ability in prison, or one has the ability, to completely verify everything. That is an impossibility doing outpatient counseling. A, you don't have access to it. B, you probably wouldn't think about doing it. C, the assumption is the person that's seeing you is going to be honest. And that's part of the problem. So those that have never worked in prison, and once upon a time I would not have believed what I'm about to say, but they haven't got a clue.
So what sort of backgrounds do these men come from? Are there commonalities in terms of dysfunction, poverty, things like that? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Jacqueline, are you referring to the sex offenders or just inmates in general?
Specifically the sex offenders.
Yeah. It turns out that there's probably about 8 categories. Now, I haven't published this. I have charts on survivorsupport.net, also on my Twitter feed, that I developed while in prison. So it's not published. At some point in time, I might publish it. But in my estimation, there's 8 different categories. It runs the gamut. Really, in terms of intentionality and moral character. In my estimation, that's what you're looking for. It'll tend to match, in a way, the type of offense, but not always. For instance, in the U.S., there's Bill Clinton. Would we say that Bill Clinton is mild, though he's never been in prison for what he did? No, Bill Clinton is not mild. He's a white-collar psychopath, in my estimation, and that's not a political statement, and I'm not calling him names. For a white-collar psychopath, he's an excellent white-collar psychopath. Now, let me define white-collar psychopath. That term came from Robert Hare himself. Robert Hare did, the example of Bernie Madoff in the U.S., who headed up the NASDAQ and ran a Ponzi scheme and took everybody's money. I forget how much money, but just millions and millions of dollars. Well, how many victims did Bernie Madoff have? So during our training, Robert Hare gave the example, because he split psychopathy into two aspects. One is, or psychopaths, one is the bloody psychopath that we all think of, Alfred Hitchcock's movie Psycho. And that's what most of us think of when we hear the term psychopath. But a psychopath really is simply this: somebody without a conscience. And if you don't have a conscience, there's going to be two other things. You're not going to feel sorry for anybody. You're not going to have any empathy. And you're not going to feel sorry that you did it. Therefore, no remorse. Those three things. Now, there's other characteristics. Those are the primary characteristics of a psychopath. I think most of us are more comfortable in believing that a psychopath or psychopathy is a category of a kind of person. And when you read the literature, they will all the literature will try to say that psychopaths are born, or they're, in my estimation, they're not born. They are made. They've done brain scans, but the question is this: what can you get from a brain scan? What can you deduce? The only thing you can deduce, and anybody can go and Google brain scans of a psychopath. As a matter of fact, a film that I use in training about psychopaths, very well done, and it covers the points in the Hare psychopathy checklist, is what's called, it's a documentary. It's on Google, or I'm sorry, YouTube. It's called The Psychopath Next Door, and it's out of Canada. A company produced that. Very well done. There's a few more things that it should add, but they do a very nice job kind of chronicling this up-and-coming CEO. And so as Robert Hare described the white-collar psychopath, the difference is a bloody psychopath is very impulsive and will have a visible body count, but he won't have too many because he's going to get busted. A white-collar psychopath is smart, and he doesn't have blood on his hands. I joke saying he lets somebody else do that. So with sex offenders, I think it's best to view them, instead of categories, it's best to view them on a continuum. And what I noticed with the pedophiles, they are true white-collar psychopaths. They have no conscience. To harm a child, you have no conscience. They're not sorry, because if they were sorry, they would have confessed long before they were busted. And they have no empathy. They try to fake it, but they have no empathy. That's why they repeat it. And the reason why, even I come from a Christian perspective, but secular or not, anybody that studies psychopaths, what they'll tell you is all the best research indicates there's no hope of turning things around. And that's very true. When you look at the brain scans, it's permanent. There is a point of no return. And once that brain reaches that, and it doesn't have to do with white or gray matter, it has to do with processing. It's very fascinating that conscience, though no one can pinpoint where it is, but conscience and empathy tend to sort of light up in similar places in the brain around the temporal lobes. There will be very little activity in the occipital region, the very back of the brain, when they're testing psychopath versus normal brains. And the difference is this: when someone is shown very quick images faster than they can process consciously, everything from a child falling down on a bike to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and horrible things, your brain's going to register that. So it's not a conscious thing. Your brain is now registering based upon your values, based upon who you are as a person, and you can see it on a color MRI. For a normal person, you can see that they are feeling deeply as they're watching people in pain. And it happens to light up around the around the temporal area. The occipital area has to do with analysis. So they're feeling deeply, long before they can put words to it. For a psychopath, it's reverse, which means they're not feeling anything. They're analyzing what the right response should be. What would I call that in modern day terms? 50 Shades of Grey. And now move towards pedophilia. So the background of pedophiles, you have a number of different types. Most of us think in terms of the snatch and grab guy with the trench coat. That's who most of us think of, like red flags, stranger danger, those kind of things. And those are genuine concerns. Those are the guys that are going to grab a kid and put him in a van and off they go. And I'm not minimizing that whatsoever. I've had to work with those kind of guys. But the question is, how many victims do they have? Probably not all that many. They're going to get busted. But what about the guy that has 100, 200, 300 victims? Put a priest collar on him. Now, that's not an anti-Catholic statement. That was just for shock value to help people realize, and I'm Protestant, so dress him up as a pastor. Dress him up as a U.S. Olympic doctor called Larry Nassar. Dress him up as a teacher. The majority of the most sophisticated pedophiles are well-educated. They're well-spoken. They're well-adjusted. They maintain employment. Oftentimes they're married. They will be the people least likely to be suspected. And when you watch the response of people around them when they get busted, what you hear is something along the lines of, "I can't believe it. Not him." They are the Keith Ranieris, though Keith Raniere is of NXIVM, though he's a psychopath. He's not a pedophile. But pedophiles, unlike actually what Robert Hare has written, but still very good stuff that he's written, the worst of the worst, the most sophisticated pedophiles, and the very worst kind, are the religiously inclined, quite frankly. They are the ones, sorry, I'll get my eyes up here so you all can see me. They are the ones that will be purposefully targeting churches. That's the worst kind, because they go to the one place that people are trusting the most. They already have their guard down, even more than at school, even more than coaches. It is the religious ones that are the darkest of any category of psychopath. They rank up there with Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of people. So
John, you said that these predators aren't born this way. So what do you think, what happens in their life? Is it our culture that's kind of shaping these offenders? Like, what do you think is, creating these?
Excellent question. I was probably under the impression, as most of us are, because a lot of information has gone into literature. That literature then makes its way into college textbooks, and then it makes its way into the general understanding. So if we were to ask either us or the average person, what makes somebody do that? Most people are going to say what they've been taught, which is, well, they were probably sexually abused, and therefore they're reenacting the abuse on the same age. They choose the same age victim that they were when they were perpetrated. Another one is they have low self-esteem for that. There's so many of them here. They are minor attracted and have been that way since birth. So that's a big one being floated out there. They call them MAPS, minor attracted people. That's what I call that is minor lust-filled adult men, quite frankly, but MAPS. So there's now a big push to say that these men, as a matter of fact, James Cantor out of Canada, he is really the primary person, in my estimation, that is floating all this. And he is very intent upon adding P for pedophile at the end of the LGBTQRST stuff. His next push, and those of his ilk, are to have pedophiles or pedophilia be become known as a sexual orientation. I'm not sure about Australia, but I'll tell you the implications in the U.S. That will then give them, it'll give them protected status. It'll give them civil rights, which means if anybody then speaks out against it, in the U.S. it's now called a hate crime. So that would be very interesting, wouldn't it? Because then it's no longer against the law. Or now you've got the ultimate dilemma. Pedophiles used to want to go after the age of consent. They still do, but they're not going to be very successful in Western countries. So they've done a back door. And what they've done is they have created the trans movement, quite frankly. And that's the back door. What causes it? Well, I went into prison assuming it was all of those things that I listed, that they had been sexually abused, that they were possibly minor attracted, but I hadn't thought that deeply about that one. They had low self-esteem and they slipped. Turns out none of that's true. How do I know? Because after spending enough time and you listen in group, which has a wide variety of sex offenders, at least in the U.S., they don't do groups based upon offense specific. So you can have in one group 12 to 15 men that run the gamut of offense. Everything from a guy that should have been focused on college girls his own age, he's still hanging out with, high school girls, all the way to snatch and grab rapists, philanderers, but then in group you have pedophiles. Well, the first thing you quickly notice is the majority of the group wants to kill the pedophiles, and you're trying to keep tension down. So that was very interesting to me. It's like, wait a second, even within this label, right? And in street terms, at least in the U.S., they call them baby rapers. So you've got all these. So that was an interesting dynamic that I wouldn't have anticipated. That's not in the textbooks. So the question is this: in prison, where nobody really cares about offenses, they're not going to judge each other. They're like, I did strong-armed robbery. I did carjacking. Nobody really cares except that one category. So the question is, in the largest, among the largest population of people that don't have any morals, why are they upset then with one category? Because they're not politically correct. They know the truth. And the one thing that you will see in a prison setting that you won't see in an office setting is you'll see raw truth. And so I was able to watch other men in sex offender group that didn't buy the crap that the pedophiles were dishing out. And as a matter of fact, they'll interrupt them. So you have this raw truth coming out that to the average researcher or clinician, we're assuming that when something comes out of somebody's mouth in counseling, it's genuine. You can take it to the bank. Not so with pedophiles. So I started to notice that the majority of sex offenders viewed the pedophiles as the consummate liars, which is interesting for criminals, for inmates. Then I started to notice, and this is when it really started to gel for me, when I started to inquire of each of them, because they have to talk about their offenses and then what contributed, I started to see that among all the sex offenders, there was a willingness to talk in less than psychological terms, just very open and normal kind of terms. But the more heinous the sex offender, in terms of the greater degree of victims, the more planning, the more methodical, you started to have these terms come out, and regardless of which group. So I have multiple groups going on, and I'm hearing certain catchphrases. I'm hearing psychological terms from these guys, thinking, who's been studying? Okay, none of the other sex offenders are adept except the pedophiles. Well, that stands out. And then I started to hear this phrase, only from the pedophiles. And this is pre-puberty, prepubescent, and lower. So that's a distinguishing factor. As a matter of fact, I would, a lot of the inmates want to debate age of consent. What is or isn't legal? You will get in a debate with them. They'll take you around the barn. Right? It's useless. And so even though legally you need to talk about that, what I did is I would throw all that out the window, because then the guys don't have anything to debate about. And I would simply say this, guys, if you lived way back in the Roman Empire when anything goes, how low would you go in terms of age? And I said, don't look at anybody else. You look at me. Curious. 15. And of course, now I'm going to start to drop it. I've got men, wide variety of fences, that are staring at me. And I can see them. They're in a half circle. I can see nonverbals. And as I started to go lower, and I know everybody's offenses, I started to notice something that was consistent every single time. Depending upon the age of victim, you would see a reaction. So the guys that would offend against adult women, when you say, and you get lower than about 15, they'll viscerally, you'll see it. It's like, oh my gosh. So now they're not playing this age of consent issue. Then there's a gap between 15, 14, 13. You get to about age 12, and where is that? That's about when puberty starts. There's a clear line of demarcation, viscerally and non-verbally, between those men, and you could tell as I'm going lower, they almost do this. There, you know you're dealing with a world of difference when the majority of sex offending males no longer now are focusing on age. They intuitively know no one in their right mind is going to touch a kid age 11. Very interesting. Age 12, probably age 13. Yeah, and it's when they started to think, you could see, they're all kind of, you knew there was still some hope, because now they're trying to figure out, okay, how, well, but then you go age 9, and now only the pedophiles are still, they know they got to give some reaction, but now you can see all the rest of them are like, oh my gosh, Uhler, what there? So that started to help me understand there's a very, very different thing going on the inside, a different category, different population. Among those groups of men, when I ask, why did you do what you did? Not only are they psychologically adept and astute, they also are very good with computers, generally speaking. They would be the one population that would not be forthright about their offense, no matter what. You had to drag it out. But when I asked, what do you think caused you to do what you did? It was only out of that population of guys, of men, that would say something. And I heard this too many times, and I sort of let it go by the first number of groups. But then I thought, wait a second, what is this? Well, Mr. Uhler, hurt people hurt people. And so the first couple of groups, I mean, to my shame now that I think about it, and I finally stopped one guy, remember the day, and I said, repeat that. He said, well, hurt people hurt people. I said, help me understand that, define that for me. And he's staring at me and like, don't you guys? I said, no, I may be a little slow today. I said, help Mr. Uhler here. He says, well, hurt people, like, Mr. Uhler, I was hurt, and so I hurt somebody. I said, oh. He didn't know he said the wrong thing to me. Why? Because my background is dealing with who? Survivors. Now he doesn't know. Now I'm really rageful. I'm contained. I'm thinking, you little schmuck, really. So I said, so what you're saying is because you were hurt, you hurt somebody. I said, kind of like having a bad day, and you come home, you're in a mood, and I said, oh, okay. So now, is being in a mood, coming home, having a bad day, versus dropping your pants and raping somebody, is that kind of, do I walk down the street and all of a sudden rape somebody just because I said, and all the other sex offenders are going, oh my gosh, no. I said, and that must have really bothered you when you were on the receiving end of it. Oh, Mr. Yin, yeah. Well, question for you then. If you knew what it felt like, why would you do that to somebody else? And that's when I realized, based upon his response, and then consistently throughout the years while I was doing sex offender, they had no explanation because they had been lying. That's when I realized, I mean, that was a major revelation, that there had been lies floated by sex offenders to researchers, whether naive or intentionally willing to work with them. I call them predator apologists, sorry. Sorry about that. That they took this, it's not even a half-truth. They took a lie, wrote it down as though it can be trusted, and then took it back and did what with it? Put it into their findings. And therefore now, what goes into the literature? What goes into the textbooks? Well, pedophiles have been abused. How do we know? Well, they were also sexually abused. Okay, how do we know? Is there any video footage? How do we know? Because they said so. Think about that. All the major beliefs that we've gotten with regard to pedophiles come from what? Their self-reports. So the self-reports of the world's greatest liars, and we believed it. That's staggering. Why? Because the reality is this. Having worked with kids that have been on the receiving end of abuse, sexual abuse, is there such a thing as child-on-child offense? Of course. But for anybody that's worked with kids, we know one thing, that if a child has been perpetrated upon, so let's take child-on-child, the victim is going to be impacted for life, but going to be impacted during the developmental years. You will see a disrupted young person in one way or another. Okay, and so that's hopefully with counseling, the kid will get better. But you'll see it in junior high and high school. There will be an impact one way or the other. For any kid that quote unquote acts out, we know that they didn't come up with that on their own. Somehow that was inputted into them, usually onto them. So now they are acting out. Okay. The question is, how did somebody find out they were acting out? Does that behavior suddenly go away? Absolutely not. We all understand that. We're talking years of therapy. If a child's acting out, that child's going to be in therapy a long time. Then developmentally, so let's say elementary school. But we all know, working with kids, if anybody has, around about junior high or middle school, or I don't know the term in Australia, but 6th, 7th, 8th grade, as puberty kicks in, now we're going to have a different stage, and then high school. So you're going to see these troubled kids evidence that they're going to have problems along the way. And hopefully counseling can help. But there will be a paper trail with kids who have been either perpetrated upon, which means 100% of them have been perpetrated upon. The question is, do any of those turn around and act out? You will have, at least in the U.S., you'll have social services and or juvenile justice system involved. There's a lot of services being brought to bear. There's a lot of people. There's therapists. Is it realistic to believe that if somebody was sexually abused, if a kid was, they're going to show no signs? Maybe 1 in a million. But even then, any of us that have worked with kids know, no, you know what? The worst case scenario, maybe the best case scenario, they withdraw. But you're going to have one of two extremes because it's an extreme thing that's happened to the child. They're going to act out, or they're going to begin to withdraw and maybe act in. By the time they get into high school, now that pattern, and depending upon what age they were perpetrated upon, now you're going to see a more pronounced cluster of behaviors, either now additional aggression and drugs and alcohol, or withdraw, self-injurious behaviors. You're going to see that if the kid hasn't gotten help. So it is not believable. Theoretically, we can talk about it, but it's practically speaking, any of us that have worked with kids, it is not believable to say if a kid was perped on, he's not going to have symptoms. There's going to be symptoms along the way.
It's a myth, right? Really, that these pedophiles were abused as children.
There you go. So how I differentiate it is this. If you have somebody that has been perpetrated upon as the victim, almost inevitably, unless you see it as a child, but almost inevitably, that young person will grow into an adult that is hypervigilant and very protective of kids. If they were the acting out kind, they will have problems that will come to teachers' attentions and authorities' attentions all along the way, because you don't have that level of aggression where now a kid wants to molest. That doesn't go away overnight. Those kids usually end up in residential treatment. I've worked with that kind. Okay. What the sophisticated predators that get interviewed, that are in groups, what they want us to believe is this: there was no behavioral indication in their life because they're bright, they're articulate, they are self-controlled, they hold down steady jobs. There's nothing about them that causes them to stand out. They don't have a lot of tattoos, they don't have a lot of piercings, they are just normal. They are our coaches, our teachers, our clergy, they are everything normal. But there's zero indication that they were perped on. They made it all the way through their 30s, 40s, 50s. No indication, and everybody around them is surprised.
So if they,
nobody's surprised. If you take a child that was perped on, nobody is surprised he's still having problems years later. So it was a grand lie that was foisted upon us, assuming that, so unwitting researchers or researchers that darn well know, but it defies reality to say that a man that's perping on kids was perped on himself but showed no behavioral signs. That's beyond credulity.
So I mean, you're saying that these men have self-control. So if they have self-control, why don't they have self-control when it comes to abusing children? Why can't they control themselves?
Yeah. Excellent question. As I was really zeroing in on all of this and wanting to know, I started to discover what I call the twisting process, or what in psychology they call deviance. The term deviance, I use it in one of three ways, quite frankly, but it's all the same. Deviance, as you know, statistically speaking, it comes from the world of statistics. You have so many deviations outside the norm. So if you call somebody abnormal, they don't like it. But if you say, you know what, you're way outside, okay. So if you're outside the norm, you are deviant. Now the question is, what are you into? If you're into bungee jumping, you're probably deviant in a good sort of way. Okay, you're adrenaline junkie kind of thing. But if you're a sexual deviant, you're way outside the norm. Okay, but what's also true is this: you are doing really extreme things and you're harming people by that time. The process of that, as somebody starts to get outside the norm, there's an internal twisting process that takes place as someone is starting down the road to psychopathy. And the best way to view it is a slippery slope. And there are stages. I've plotted out about 10 stages. And as I started to finally see this, and I was very purposeful then in listening for it and watching for it, you can actually plot out these 10 different stages and how the person thinks, talks, not so much talks, but rationalizes, justifies, how they will respond to truth in terms of both confessing what they've done versus going through the motions. It also has to do with moral development and character development. It has to do with their inner world in terms of what they hunger and thirst after, what attracts them. And as a person starts to get worse, and it took me a while to figure this out, as someone gets worse and worse, they're getting more and more into darker stuff. They know that the average person on the street is going to assume they are lusting. We're sexually attracted. That's because we, normal people, are sexually attracted. But if you start going downhill, it changes. And it moves from being sexually attracted, and this is very subtle, but this is this inverting process, this twisting process. It moves from sexual attraction, which also, the first level of healthy sexuality is I care about my partner. I care about their feelings. I care about what they're experiencing. If I start to move downhill in terms of selfishness, ultimately, what starts to happen to me? I'm not so concerned about my partner anymore. Now it's self-gratification. But now I'm at about a level 2 or 3. If I continue down, and what's going to now in the year 2019, what's going to start to inevitably enter into the picture? Porn. And that, quite frankly, is the basis of all pedophiles. 100% of all sex offenders, regardless of the age of victims, 100% are heavily involved in progressive porn. For the pedophiles, 100% were using child porn prior to getting busted, because 100% are busted with child porn. I challenge anybody to find a news story of somebody that's busted for child-related crimes and there's not child porn. How do I know? Because I had to read thousands of files, about 1,000 pedophile files over 11 years. And you know what percentage had child porn? 100. So either we're supposed to believe that the person was not using child porn until the very day they were busted. But how were they busted? Because online the authorities started to do what? Track them. Track what? Their use of child porn. Yet if you were to have asked every single one of those pedophiles, 100% of them, the day before they got busted, where they don't know they're about to get busted, if they're using child porn, if you're the therapist or a researcher and you ask, are you using child porn, what will 100% of them say? What are you talking about? Okay, why? Two things. They're not going to admit it. Plus, they know it's illegal. Plus, the therapist, if a therapist is ethical, they're a mandated reporter. So 100% of minor attracted persons or non-offending pedophiles, whatever term we want to use, 100% will deny they're into child porn while they're into child porn. 100. This is not opinion. This is just facts.
So I mean, these pedophiles, they prior to sort of abusing children, it starts with child pornography. So with are they starting with sort of normal, vanilla, porn with adult women, and then it kind of progresses?
Yes, and that's the dirty little secret as well. 100% of sex offenders always start with adult porn. I didn't know that. Would never have known that. But when you start to hear it from the inmates, and when they start to call one another on it, and here's another thing. Every category of sex offender, in sex offender treatment, once you finally say it's porn, first of all, the material, talk about pathetic, the cognitive behavioral therapy material that we used to use never even camped on the issue of porn. So it never came up. So it took me about a year or two to all of a sudden clue in. And I remember the day that I finally announced in one of the groups, I said, I'm beginning to wonder something. So I went through this extravagant little thing saying, you know what, the idea of garbage in, garbage out. And you all were talking about offenses, but man, you guys seem normal. We're having discussions here. And I'm trying to envision you guys becoming somebody's worst nightmare and how that happened. And what I'm being told by some of you is it's your background, but it's the darndest thing. What I haven't heard is garbage in. And they knew. So I said, you know what? I think you guys need to have this help me, or help it make sense to me. And finally, we started to have really productive groups, because I told the guys, until you can make sense of how you got where you got in terms of offense, and describe the porn you were using so that it makes sense to me, now what you were quote-unquote acting out, I said, I'm probably going to fail you. Help it make sense to me. I said, I don't care if you're embarrassed or not. You should be. Look at what you did to people. But at the same time, then at least we got something to work with. Then you know how far you fell. and what started to happen to you, and how you as a man became somebody's worst nightmare when you were designed to be chivalrous and protective. What happened to you? During that process also, I realized, and so I finally started on a regular basis bringing it up to the guys. In that process of first starting out by lusting, when a man starts to become deviant and twisted, it shifts from lust and, again, once upon a time, caring about somebody else, but now being self-centered, to now the element of, and it's not just power and control. They've already also moved through that. Now it is, unless I can see that I'm creating or generating discomfort or pain, I can't get excited. It's not exciting. And enter 50 Shades of Grey. That should shock all of us, number one. Because now we're not even talking sex offenders. What are we talking? At least here in the U.S., that whole trilogy in terms of videos is sold in Walmart. Look at what we are doing to young kids. And we wonder then how this is translating into, we look at the ages, the younger and younger ages of kids that are offending. Because we don't understand, if that's what we're showing them, if that's what we're telling them is normal, what we've done now is quote-unquote entertainment. And things that I will post 50 Shades of Grey. And without exception, the guys that are deviant, they respond back like, that's entertainment, correct. The moment I get to a point where I think that's entertainment, I'm now deviant as a guy. Why? Because he's harming that woman. That's the difference, that once a guy becomes twisted, and I remember the one group when I figured it out, because I had to figure it out for myself. All the other guys knew it. Because the one common denominator is this. In a world that is so sex saturated, and you get sex for free anywhere, I mean anywhere. As a matter of fact, you have to work hard to stay away from it. The question is this. Why would you need to offend? Because it's not about sex at that point anymore. It's not even about power and control, because you can get that anywhere as well. It's about generating pain. It's about generating distress. Now you're abnormal. And that's the thing it took me forever to figure out, that all of a sudden I'm working with men that aren't normal anymore, and they don't even know they're not more normal. And the day, I remember it gelled after a couple of years, and all of a sudden I'm looking at these guys, and I said, guys, for some of you there's no hope because you guys think this is boring. You know, what Uhler talks about is boring, where I try to get through to you. And I said, that's fine, just be bored, whatever. Just don't cause a ruckus, which should tell you as well. Somebody that's truly twisted, this type of conversation would be boring to them. As a matter of fact, ladies, if you're dating a man and he doesn't want to listen to this, that's a good dating screening mechanism right there. If you're dating a man, say, hey, you know what? I heard this thing. I want you to listen to it with me. If he says no or he's bored, run. Absolutely, because you're in trouble. Why? Because he's bored. He doesn't find anything about this compelling. So that's free of charge, by the way. So that's a little dating thing. But I remember telling the guys, as I looked at them, I said, you guys don't even know how far you've fallen from what you used to be once upon a time. I said, you can't even get excited without seeing trauma in their eyes, can you? And I remember one guy, which shows you how sad. So I've got a room of 12 to 15 guys, and only one guy, I almost get touched. You could tell. See, I get touched over this. Because you always want to believe there's hope. And I remember the look in his eyes. It's like, oh my gosh, what have I become? That's rare.
I mean, it's
so
not,
and he had only adult victims.
Yeah.
So by the time a man is offending a child, what's motivating him is not lust, is not sexuality, but the desire and the hunger and the pull of traumatizing, of stealing purity, of defrauding trust, of knowing that this young child will forever spend a lifetime getting over him. He will leave his mark on her soul or his soul. And he's stolen part of their soul. And he likes it.
Mm. It's like our society is set up to create this. You know, there's kids being exposed to porn younger and younger now with smartphones. I worked as a teacher for a long time, and kids, you know, on average now are being exposed to pornography from other children on the school bus, in the schoolyard, even in the classroom. Kids are showing, you know, other kids porn on average at the age of 11. So,
Correct.
I mean,
Correct.
even sort of we're becoming desensitized to feel empathy for other people through our media. Yeah, the mainstream media and the news and Hollywood films and sort of I call it violent porn, like Quentin Tarantino films. We you know we've got a society that gets off on
That's right.
on violence and the pain of other people.
That's right. And what's going to happen? We have unleashed, and people, we're not prepared for it. We have unleashed very young psychopaths. We as a society, we're in trouble unless people take this seriously. Unless they take the time to really listen to people that have studied this. As a matter of fact, the first person that tried to raise the alarm was Ted Bundy himself.
Yes.
Ted Bundy in the U.S. Right? It's on YouTube. You can Google Ted Bundy and James Dobson.
Yeah.
People poo-pooed it because James Dobson comes from a Christian perspective. Ted Bundy chose only one person to interview him hours before his death. The media was clamoring. Ted Bundy, a serial murderer. Ted Bundy had a lot of different news outlets trying to interview him. And there's a recent movie, I haven't seen it, about Ted Bundy, but the facts are this. Ted Bundy denied everybody an interview, but he himself, through his attorney, reached out to Dr. James Dobson of Focus on the Family at that time. So Dr. Dobson reports that he gets this call from the attorney, and just before Bundy was going to be sent to the electric chair. James Dobson had served on the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography and had issued for the cautionary side of people. You had, I think the guy that did, what is his name? Larry Flint of Penthouse was on there. So you had opposing sides, as it were. But Dobson and a few others issued a concern that's saying porn is addictive and it's going to harm people. Ted Bundy heard about that. He got that report. And so he wanted to give his story to James Dobson. And that is part of also what compelled me to really dig deep, because Dobson only had a few hours with Bundy. The guys I was working with, I had months. I could pull them out. So I dug really, really deep. But everything that Ted Bundy said, the media mocked, because Ted Bundy said it was porn. Back then, he came across a magazine and it grabbed him. And the reason why people mock him is we don't want to believe that. Why? Because the implications are staggering. But what happens if he was telling the truth? And what we're seeing now is exactly why Ted Bundy was telling the truth. That you have, I mean, when would we have ever viewed what used to be a method of torturing somebody in the Middle Ages, and now that's on the cover of 50 Shades of Grey, and we call that entertainment. I mean, people yawn when I say 50 Shades of Grey, and they say, that's not porn. That's entertainment. It's over for a culture. Because who's being harmed? The women. And women are being led to believe what? That's acceptable, that's normal, that's what you have to do. Ladies, let me tell you now, use that as a test. Ask a guy, hey, what do you think about 50 Shades of Grey? If he isn't appalled by 50 Shades of Grey, you better stay away from him. Why? Because he's not appalled by it. That means you are a piece of meat. That's a meat locker.
Well, it's a sexualization of violence, isn't it?
That's all it is. And that means he's deviant. Yeah. That means he's perpetrating harm, and he finds that exciting. That's a psychopath. Yeah. Yeah. And there's no coming back from that. And that's why, and what it looks like for them, if you ask them, they've lost the want to come back. They go further. That's that slippery slope. That a psychopath doesn't. As a matter of fact, the only person that doesn't believe a psychopath is a psychopath himself. He'll say, "I'm a sociopath." It's quite something.
So by the time, in terms of rehabilitation, by the time these men are, by the time someone like you is trying to, counsel them, it's almost too late, isn't it? We have to sort of go back to the beginning.
It's too late.
And
it's too late.
Just,
I didn't want to believe
changes.
it. Yeah, I didn't want to believe it because I'm coming from the street, even though, again, I worked with survivors. I still want to believe because, were some of them physically abused? Yeah. But there's a big difference between being physically abused. Now, some weren't, but a world of difference. Because if you're still on the receiving end of, dad, beat you around, I'm not minimizing any of that. But you mean to tell me that guy's then going to go out and rape apples and oranges? So, did every pedophile live the idyllic life? No. But nor did a lot of us. We don't walk around doing that. So the reason why a guy offends, especially a child, is always porn. Now, some people say, well, what about prior to porn? I say he simply had to work harder to become that deviant. There's always been pedophiles, absolutely. But you mean to tell me in the year 2019, where if you ask people, what percentage of guys do you think are into porn? We've all heard different figures, and that presupposes they're being honest, but probably a lot. So out of that, the majority of men then are into porn. But what we're being told by researchers about minor attracted people is this. Of all those men that do porn, we've got a certain select people that lust after kids, but they've never done porn. Okay, really. So out of all those men that lust, we have one group that lusts, never done porn. And certainly never looked at the porn of the category they lust after.
They learn it from
I've got a bridge to sell you, really. But that's the premise, and that's why what I talk about all the time, especially on social media, and they hate it, is porn is the reason for pedophilia. That's all.
I mean, it's sex education now, isn't it?
Yeah, why do they hate that? Because the moment that sinks in, then we know that all empathy for pedophiles is going to go away. And they know that. So they have to make it something else other than porn. Once people find out that the reason why a man offends a child is because he's porn saturated, and he went from normal porn to dark porn to deviant porn to barely legal, that's a term that the inmates use. And at that point, he's going to figure out what directions he's heading, what direction, and if he keeps going lower, it'll get into really heinous stuff and eventually child porn. And child porn and snuff porn go hand in hand. It's not by accident. How does a man become a pedophile? Hours and hours and hours of porn, 100% of the time.
With the sort of proliferation of, iPhones and internet porn, like in the days of Ted Bundy and his murders, I mean, that was, decades before we had the accessibility of internet porn. Are these crimes on the rise?
I think guys are more sophisticated. The question is this: how much do we think human trafficking is going on? The stats for the U.S. Department of Justice, the amount of internet crimes, and then Interpol. When you look at, it's just astronomical. 2018, I think, there was one bust of 2,700 men or people. This year, that was 2018, but that was a single bust, an operation. This year in January, I think 1,900. Let that sink in. And those are the only ones that they can find, that they've been able to bust. You have virtual private networks. These guys are so sophisticated that I don't know the stats, but my guess is this: of the amount of people the authorities bust for child porn, it's always child trafficking. because they're watching a child be hurt. The question is this: I wonder what law enforcement would say their own sense is. What percentage are they capturing? Probably a very low percentage. So if you have an operation, a single operation in the U.S. that captures 2,900 people, the question is, what in the world's going on that we don't even know about? And also, how about missing and exploited children? When you begin to see the numbers, we're talking stadium, football and soccer stadium numbers. Where are all those kids? You know, maybe some of them show up, but the question, but this is yearly. And we don't want to think about it, but I'll tell you what, how do you hide a stadium full of kids per year? That's 40,000, 50,000, but it's more than that. Where are these kids going, and why don't they ever show up as adults? It's, you know, sometimes the predators count on us not wanting to go there with our minds. I didn't want to until I started working with survivors, and then you hear, it's like, oh my gosh, it's this veil. The human mind, I get touched. I mean, once upon a time, if somebody asked me, you know, John, what's the worst thing somebody could do? You know, I wouldn't have come close. Honestly, it was so far out of my own experience, and I didn't know there were people that tortured kids. Who does that? The human heart has not changed very much over the eons. So it's very, very dark. So yeah, there are people out there that it's just getting worse. Yeah. Darker and darker.
Yeah. Unless we, you know, there's, I mean, it's a huge kind of global problem, isn't it? And we're really, how do we turn things around? I mean, what do you think, you know, what is missing in these people's lives that...
See, it's not, and that's an excellent question. What I tell people is this: it's not so much what's missing, because we're coming from a human perspective, then a normal perspective. We want to believe that. We would, for those of us that are normal, when we do something, it's because maybe something's lacking. When you sexually offend somebody, it's not anything lacking. That's an affair. Right? If somebody has an affair, oftentimes there's stuff lacking. But that's with adults. That's, you know, some enchanted evening across a crowded room or at the water cooler at the office. But when we're talking about kids, it's not about sex. No. Therefore, it's not about lacking. No. That's the thing we have to get over and begin to realize it's not about lust, it's not about sexuality. It's about a spirit within them, as it were, that they hunger and thirst after traumatizing. That's very different. It's a psychopath. And for a psychopath, think in terms of financially, and this sometimes can help people grasp it. Let's say you had countless millions of dollars, like some of these people do. Why would they get into trading schemes on the New York Stock Exchange or the different stock exchanges? How many millions can you have? Because it reaches a certain point that it ain't about the money. It's about the game. We can't understand that because we all live on a budget and we're normal. But I think if you allow your mind to think about that, when you look at the inside traders, they all have multiple millions and they're not in debt. Why do they do that? Because they are financial psychopaths. You layer on top of that even sexuality, and it's that same concept. That's why it's never enough. It will never be enough, because it's not about the thing. It's about getting over. It's chess for them. And that's why also pedophiles love to groom in plain sight, especially around parents. And now let's segue into the trans movement for a moment, and drag queen story hour, or these drag queens, okay? The Drag Queen Story Hour is the farm team for the trans, and let me tell you why I say all that. What men do with other men is, you know, I'll say it's nobody's business. It's weird, you know, it's unhealthy. Okay, but nobody can ever look at anything I've written that'll ever say men shouldn't be doing that with men. I don't think they should, but I've never written about that. It's when men who wear women's underwear and dresses. They want to get around kids. Now we got a problem. The question is, why do they want to be around kids? Oh, they'll tell you why, but isn't it interesting in marriage and family counseling? One of the things you hear most out of wives is this complaint. My husband just won't spend time with our kids. That's one of the most often complaints. He's involved with his buddies. He's a workaholic. He's always into sports. And so my kids are always wishing Daddy would spend more time. That's the average guy. Here's one of the red flags. If you have a man that's very interested in spending time with other people's kids, red flag. Why? Because it's not normal. Now, does that mean kids don't need? No, kids need a dad and all that, but not by themselves, not in a weird getup. Okay, if somebody's actually acting sexualized, drag queens wearing women's underwear, and they want to be around kids, folks, that's a huge red flag. Why? Why doesn't he take his little getup and go down to the local convalescent hospital and read to shut-in adults? Oops. It shows you it is about the kids. He wants access to the kids.
Yeah, and a lot of these men that like the drag queens doing drag queen story hour that are, it's turning out that they are sort of sex offenders.
A lot of yes, a number of them sex offenders. And my apologies. Let me now tie in the trans movement. What we're seeing worldwide. The trans movement is new within the past 5 years, all things being equal, give or take. Or with Bruce Jenner, I'll still call him Bruce, I don't care. Okay, what a shame. Okay, but prior to that, did any of us hear about this trans stuff? No. So the question is this: if it's such a real thing, this large, worldwide, so much so that you have marches all over the world, right? We've all seen the marches where there's thousands and thousands of people carrying placards. I support my, trans kid and all that. First of all, who's organizing those? Kind of interesting. But I've been a therapist now for about 30 years, worked residential treatment. My colleagues have worked in those venues. I went to grad school, and the question is this: why didn't any of us ever see or hear any of this until about 5-10 years ago? Let's say 5 years ago.
Yep.
If it's a real thing, then it should have still existed then. Yeah. What it means is this: everybody within mental health and psychology were intellectually dense and stupid, and we did malpractice if we didn't see such a real thing, because it has been there all along, evidently. That means I could start with Freud and start moving up through all these theorists, Adler and Rogers and Glasser, and we could go through all the theories. That means they were dense, brain dead, and stupid. All the graduate schools, nobody talked about this. They were brain dead and stupid. Medical schools, they were brain dead and stupid. Or we weren't brain dead and stupid. Something has happened, a new phenomenon. Are there worldwide phenomena? We've seen a couple of them. Some start with literature, Harry Potter. But could you also have a worldwide movement that catches on? Yeah. We see in small ways with cults how you have impact on people, where people start to act in detrimental ways. But it's this group think that starts to take on. We understand about peer culture, and that's very powerful. Fads, we call them. But could it be that you would have special interests that might be very interested in creating something? I believe yes. Now, is there such a thing as gender dysphoria? Not the way it's being sold now. Gender dysphoria, a kid is confused about his sexuality. I'll tell you how you get that. It's 4 ways. Okay. Number 1 way, the primary thing, is the child was sexually abused. If a child brings up the issue, a boy says, I hate being a boy, I wish I was a girl. I'll tell you what, if you're a therapist and you don't automatically think sexual abuse, you have an issue because you're a mandated reporter. And you have to know that no kid suddenly comes up with that on his own. So you're going to begin to inquire, well, isn't it interesting, at least in the Western world, there's a big push for what's called anti-conversion therapy. Let me define that. Conversion therapy, that sounds religious. What that simply means is this. A kid is starting to go into the homosexual lifestyle, the alternative lifestyles. If he begins to reconsider that because of therapy, he's now converted out of that. That took work to come up with that term. So you give it a religious connotation. So somebody said that's conversion therapy, and that we're against that. So you have to be anti-conversion therapy. And if you're not, at least in the U.S., it's probably coming all over the world, there's a big push to make it that a therapist or a clinician will lose his license if he does conversion therapy. You can be fined, you can be jailed. It's happening right now in various states and in Canada. If I as a therapist know that if the result of my effective work, what I mean by that, as a clinician, your job is to help the person become whole in whatever way. The more of an adult they are, they set their, you ask them, why are you here? They set their goals. And now you're going to work towards those goals. I can't imagine, other than an actual cult, somebody comes in for therapy and says, I don't know why I'm here. Why don't you tell me what I need? You can't pay me enough. As a therapist, I'm not going to run your life for you. So if somebody says, I don't know, I'm perfectly happy, but I'm here. Okay. Now let's say he's wearing the rainbow colors. John, I'm here. I want therapy. What do you want to work on? Nothing. I'm perfectly satisfied. Okay. We will send you on your way. But if he says, you know what, I'm in this lifestyle, and now you can substitute that lifestyle for anything. A guy's having an affair. A guy's doing whatever he's doing. I'm not sure about that. I want to gain some clarity. Okay. Now am I going to tell him, you don't want to be gay because I don't like gays, and you shouldn't be gay either? Who could I do that? No, because it's not beneficial. If a kid says, I want to walk across the street, and the parent says, no, you're not going to do it. There's no self-respecting therapist that's going to try to talk somebody out of something. What a therapist does is help the person see all the pros and cons. That's what somebody does. If somebody says, you know what, John, I'm really tempted to have an affair. Okay. Somebody has to tell the person it's wrong, but it's okay. Well, tell me what I should know. That doesn't fly. What you do is you say, well, have you thought about it? What are you thinking about that? You're just really trying to help the person know really what they're thinking. Then look at, okay, how's that going to play out for you? So that when they go their way, they can't blame anybody but themselves, or nobody else gets the credit. They've now become empowered to act upon what's consistent with their values. They're not in conflict anymore. But what happens if the person says, you know what, or a young person, I'm beginning to reconsider, I don't know if I want to go into the alternative lifestyle. But if people politically have said, John, if that kid comes out of session and he starts to move away from the lifestyle, you've converted him and you're going to lose your license. So what am I going to explore when he says, you know what, I really hate being a boy, I want to be a girl? The first thing that should go through my mind is, has he been abused? But if he starts talking about it, he may actually realize he's not a girl, he's a guy, and he doesn't want to be involved in that lifestyle. So I've done successful therapy, helped him work through his stuff, but now because he's not going to be a part of that lifestyle, I'm going to lose my license. So the net effect of this quote-unquote anti-conversion therapy is nobody's going to investigate child abuse. And who benefits from that? Perpetrators. The number one thing that'll cause a kid to question his gender, so to speak, or be gender confused is child abuse. Second will be kids on the spectrum, so autism. Why? Because they don't have a lot of intuition. they're easily manipulated and talked into things. Perpetrators know that.
And
the third is if a kid has been primed through social media and things, and really the youth culture, what's going on right now. And the fourth is if somebody's been implanting stuff in their mind. You take a kid that has no influence or no interference, I should say, from the outside, he will get through adolescence just fine.
I mean, this whole agenda, it's just been aggressively pushed from so many different angles. Even, you know, in Target, they've got the sort of rainbow unicorns, and, you know,
that's right.
I see that as
by the way, unicorns are the #1 symbol for pedophiles.
Well, yeah, my niece is 6 years old, and all the she's in kindergarten this year, and
that's right.
all the
that's
kids
right.
in her. I mean, she's quite you know, a smart kid, and you know, thinks for herself. But she had a rainbow unicorn birthday party, and all her friends had a rainbow unicorn party too. Like, they don't even realize what.
And really the three special interests that are all joined together is this: you have doctors that are going to make a lot of money off of starting kids very young now on hormone blockers. And the net effect right now, kids will have, by the time they're in their early 20s, guaranteed they'll have heart problems and osteoporosis and other things, possibly even tumors in the brain, from what I've heard. Okay, Michael Laidlaw and William Malone, at least here in the States, look up some of their work. Those are endocrinologists. There's other doctors that are finally coming out. This is a huge medical ruse. We're going to have kids that are harmed for life if you toy with hormones. And the question is this: why would somebody want to toy with any kid's hormones? Remember, it's supposed to be do no harm. They're harming kids. You toy with hormones, you're harming them. Well, why would they want to do it? Because the doctor that's going to start these treatments, how long are these kids going to be on hormones? For years. Okay, that's a cash cow. That's free money. Okay, we don't want to believe that any doctors are like this. Okay, the second is the pharmaceuticals, because if a doctor's prescribing meds, guess who's going to supply them? Okay, so it's medical malpractice. These kids are being harmed. That would be bad enough. I would be agitated if that's all it was. But you have another group. Another group that's very interested in kids, two things: in kids remaining young looking and becoming very confused and able to be influenced. Because you touch a kid's sexuality, so to speak, and now you've got them. An adult example is, look what happened at Nixium. You had adult women, very intelligent, allowing themselves to be branded by a cottering iron without anesthesia. Okay, we say that, what, there? Okay, if somebody can have such sway, mental sway, they call it dark psychology now, but if somebody can manipulate a reasonably intelligent adult, look at the Jonestown thing. Everybody talks about drink the Kool-Aid. That came from Jonestown. If adults can be brainwashed or influenced, how much more kids? Well, who would benefit? The doctors, the pharmaceuticals, but pedophiles. Why? Because pedophiles now can be involved in the sex education end of things, the mentoring end of things. And if I'm a pedophile, here's what they think: I'm going to get my hands on a kid. How do you do that? The most fun is when you don't have to snatch a grab, because they're not into that, because they're going to get busted. What are you going to do? You're going to go where kids are the most easily accessed. So those are churches, but in this case we're talking schools. And you're going to begin to prime their minds. Now you're talking sex education material. You're going to begin to shape their thinking so that they don't know that what I'm going to begin to do is boundary violations. I'm going to sexualize their minds. I'm going to put them in a state of mind where they don't even know that as we're talking about boys and girls and gender fluidity, then there really aren't sexual boundaries. And the one thing that goes along with those kids that are observed to be confused about their genders is they're going to be matched up with an adult mentor in the lifestyle who will help them throughout their day and into the restroom. And if you think I'm kidding, you're naive. And there's little prosthetic things now, little special underwear. That's where this is going. And when you call it out, oh, you're transphobic and homophobic and phobic. I'm nothing other than this.
We're people that care.
Okay, it's all about child safety.
Yeah. No
adult needs to be adjusting a child. But if we call it mentoring, and if we tell a little girl now she has to have a little pair of underwear that has a fake penis in it, then it needs to be adjusted, doesn't it? We need to make sure that fits. Well, guess what? This is not hypothetical. So the group I'm most concerned about, but it's all being pushed together. So you have the medical industry, you have the pharmaceuticals, and then you have the pedophiles. And it's the pedophiles that are the ones, under the guise of all this trans stuff, that when you begin to say, you know what, let's leave the kids alone. Now you're going to see them react on social media. You're going to start to see them come out and start to yell homophobic, trans. Where'd that come from? We're just talking child safety. They will make it about the alternative lifestyles. Where did that come from? They have to throw that out because you're starting to thwart their agenda. So if you talk about, you know what, no guy acts sexualized unless he's into porn, they'll react over that. And when you say that nobody should fool around with the kid in terms of the kid's sexuality until you know what, let the kid develop on his or her own. And now they'll say that they'll make it about homosexuality or transphobia, all that stuff. And it's not. It's child safety. That knowing what I know now about predators, it's the perfect grooming and hunting opportunity. And that's what they're doing. So now, does that mean every single adult? No. Oh, okay. But quite a few. Now the question is this: can you spot? Anybody educated enough to be able to discern? No, you're not. I'm really educated on this, and it's hard for me to discern. So guess what? If in doubt, don't. There are way too many. Are there predators everywhere? Of course. As a matter of fact, my very first website was churchprotect.org. The worst of the worst pedophiles are the ones in churches. So for me, it's equal opportunity. What I say is this: do not allow men to be around kids when they're showing interest in the kids. Do not allow that by themselves. And any self-respecting guy knows it. Every guy in year 2019 knows, you know what, I shouldn't be around these kids by myself alone. Every man knows that. If he plays brain dead, he's working you. Every guy knows it. Every guy now knows to be hyper vigilant. So anybody that's fooling you, that's all they're doing. They're just working adults. The predators know us better than we know them.
John, no, we've been speaking for over an hour now. I'd love to speak to you more on this topic, and we could probably speak for another 2 hours.
Yes, we could. Yes, we could.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to speak to you about the sort of comprehensive sex education that you've got in the US, and here we've got the Safe Schools program, which is kind of sold as an anti-bullying program, but it's grooming.
Yep.
And
same thing here in the U.S.
Yeah,
it's always the guise of child protection.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy, and I would love to have you on the show again to speak some more about that. But we might wrap it up now. And thank you for talking to me today. It's been fascinating. So if anyone wants to get in touch with John, they can contact you through your organisation, Survivor Support.
Survivorsupport.net.
Yep.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I'll talk to you again soon.
There you go. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.